Welcome everyone to this Griffith Institute for Educational Research Big Picture Talk. I acknowledge that I'm joining this presentation today from Griffith University, whose campuses are located on the unceded lands of the Turrbal, Jagera, Yuggera, Yuggera, Yugambeh and Kombumerri peoples. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all of our Indigenous colleagues and students. Today's Big Picture Talk is presented by Emeritus Professor Bill Green of Charles Sturt University. Bill is truly a giant of curriculum inquiry. He won't want me to say that, but it's absolutely true. And one of the few researchers in the wider education research community who persists in raising fundamental questions about the nature of curriculum and its many ramifications from policy to practice. A selective glance at recent publications gives us a flavour of Bill's scholarship, Understanding Curriculum as Practice, or On the Practice Turns in Curriculum Inquiry, Curriculum History and Progressive Education in Australia, Renegotiating the Curriculum, Transnational Curriculum Inquiry in a Changing World. This year, Routledge published his book, Garth Boomer, English Teaching and Curriculum Leadership, and his next edited volume is Multilingualism as Opportunity, an integrated perspective on English and languages education in Australia, also published by Routledge. I should point out that today we will record Bill's talk, and right now it is with great pleasure that I hand over to Bill for his talk, Curriculum Inquiry in Australia, The Big Picture. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you, Stephen, and hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I do thank Stephen and the Institute for the opportunity. It was presented to me as an occasion to talk through some issues in curriculum inquiry, which is the term that I tend to use, and that's how I've approached it. I've not particularly worried about the absolute sort of structure of my presentation, but I hope it will be of interest to you, and that I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards. Let me say firstly, though, I'm in Bathurst, and I'm speaking from the lands of the Wiradjuri people. And I want to acknowledge that and acknowledge the Indigenous people related to the areas that you're speaking from. So, curriculum inquiry in Australia, the big picture. That's the abstract that you've seen, and what I've done there is highlight just some of the key terms. Curriculum, the issue of why curriculum matters and continues to matter, and why it is, important to me, and I think it should be to other educators, not just those with an interest or whose work is in the area of curriculum inquiry. The concern is one of understanding curriculum, and that'll come up as we go through the presentation, and I'm hoping that it will resource what I have to say, and what emerges from the discussion will be useful for curriculum inquiry and praxis, and the praxis of curriculum. So let me start with the notion of why curriculum, and think a little bit about this, and why I've been caught up in this work, and over the last 25 years, at least 30 years maybe, it's become increasingly the focus for my work. Bill Piner is a curriculum writer who has been particularly influential for me, and influential for the field in its expanded sense. And I was very intrigued in his book, What is Curriculum Theory, the first edition of which came out in 2004. And he spoke about and made a good case for his claim that curriculum is endogenous to the field of education, to the education scene, in a way that a lot of the other disciplinary areas are not. And that's intrigued me, and I've started to work from that in various sorts of ways. And his claim that only curriculum theory has its origin in and owes its loyalty to the discipline of education, it seems to me is a striking one and very interesting and well worth thinking about. We can think about the sociology of education, the psychology of education, and so on. And there's always a connection out to the disciplines of sociology and psychology and the like. And his argument is that curriculum theory is distinctive and distinctively part of education studies. The other figure that's been quite important more recently is Michael Young. Michael Young comes himself from the sociology of education and owes his allegiance to it. But it's been very interesting to follow him, his work since roughly about 2005, where he's increasingly focused on curriculum and in various ways identifies himself increasingly as with curriculum studies, albeit with a strong sociological bent. But he's suggested in various places that curriculum is the single most distinct concept that has emerged in the field of education studies. And there's a connection there, I think, that with Piner's claim, which I think is well worth thinking about. These two figures are two influential figures, very much so, and they've been increasingly reference points for me. Of course, there's a larger body of theorists and thinkers, including feminist scholars like Madeleine Grumet and others, that are part of the area of concern here. I want to shift, though, and then to thinking about the big picture. When Stephen invited me, and I'm not sure whether it's the series that you've got coming out of the centre or not, started intriguing me what constitutes the big picture, and thinking about what is various ways of thinking the so-called big picture and what it meant, and I'm still thinking that one through. But I think for our purposes, this idea of thinking beyond the given, or what seems to be the given, what seems to be what's at hand, in a kind of Heideggerian sense, those things that are at hand, or part of the doxa, if you like, thinking beyond the given, and part of that given, I think, is a lot of people kind of inside and outside of education. I think of it as either course or content, a course of study, a body of content, and the two together, perhaps. And this might be more so, perhaps, for people working outside of a school context, for instance, in higher education, where curriculum may not be as familiar, though certainly it's been focused on more in recent times than in school contexts. But still that idea of curriculum as a course of study and a body of content, either separately or together. And there is a way of thinking that through in a much richer sense, I think, through Piner himself has used the notion of GIER to pick up on the running of a course, building on that. So the actual moving through the course of study. But it is, I think, still a limited and limiting, though maybe baseline way of thinking about curriculum. I want to introduce at this point a distinction I've made previously between the transitive and the intransitive, between a transitive understanding of curriculum and an intransitive view. And I'm speaking as a curriculum scholar. I find these days people ask me what I do, and I find that really hard to say. I either say rather vaguely I'm in education and I'm an educational researcher, but I've also started saying I'm a curriculum scholar, or analogous to a literary scholar or a religion scholar or whatever. And when I do that, there's often incomprehension, or, as I say, a kind of a fallback on that default view, that limited view of being a curriculum scholar. But I want to embrace it. It's something that I probably, if I was going for a job these days, and I was looking for curriculum jobs, I think it would be very. I'd have difficulty because curriculum itself is no longer part of the teacher education curriculum. The pre-service teacher education curriculum it once was, for a while at least in Australia, and there are very few curriculum specific jobs, and certainly curriculum theory jobs in the country. When I was putting this presentation together, I came across the third edition of Piner's book, What is Curriculum Theory? Second edition was 2012, and the third edition is 2019. And there are differences across those three versions, which are very interesting and useful to pursue if you are interested in curriculum theory. But in this last one, and only this week, I came across this expression. Curriculum theory is the big picture field in education. One of those serendipity things. And what he was meaning there is the curriculum theory that he is associated with, and which in various ways I identify with, is informed, builds on the arts and humanities and social and cultural theory, therefore it is concerned with the body of scholarship more broadly, looking back into the past, thinking about the present and projecting into the future. It may be a big claim on his part, but I'll go with it for the moment. Understanding curriculum. I think this is the key thing. I suspect that many people are more concerned with developing curriculum in one way or another, or they think it's a pretty straightforward issue, and I want to dispute that. And offer you this as something I've been thinking about for quite some time now, and have written about or touched on in various places. I think there's a useful way of thinking about curriculum in a threefold sense. Curriculum as concept, curriculum as practice, and curriculum as field. What do I mean by these formulations in this diagram? I think they can be understood separately, but they are also interwoven and build to this expanded and larger sense of curriculum. The specific term curriculum, bearing in mind Pino's earlier point that curriculum theory is unique to education studies, and curriculum itself is a key term to be identified broadly with education. Curriculum as concept, curriculum as practice, curriculum as field. Let me start from the bottom up. Curriculum as field. What I mean by this is curriculum as a field of study, as a distinctive field of study, a discipline, if you like, in a somewhat looser sense, a field of study with a body of literature, a body of scholarship, of, as it were, interconnected scholarship, and thought more broadly. Curriculum as practice is the largest category and where most of the activity of curriculum workers happens. It's curriculum in the world, the idea of the doing and making of curriculum, This would include work like that of Mark Priestley and his colleagues in recent times, who's been talking about curriculum making as a specific term, and is currently involved in a handbook of curriculum, international handbook of curriculum making. The idea of curriculum as practice, as practicing curriculum, as I say, doing or making curriculum. It involves levels or scales of curriculum, curriculum happening at different levels. The micro, meso, macro. Priestley and his colleagues expands that to below the micro is what he calls the nano, and there's a larger concept, and it embraces, if you like, the worldly, the area of global curriculum work. It embraces at the bottom level the idea of the classroom as curriculum, and below that the activities within the classroom. It's a very, so in other words, it expands the realm of possibility of curriculum work, the idea of curriculum practice. There is also a sense, and Stephen mentioned this paper that I did quite recently on curriculum as practice, where practice itself is understood as a concept within what's called practice theory and philosophy. So, the first notion, curriculum as concept, the curriculum concept itself, and this is where I've done some work over a period of time, and am still doing so, trying to think through the specificity of curriculum as a concept, not just a term, but a concept. And in my own work, I draw on Deleuze and Guattari's What is Philosophy? Their book, 1994, I think it is, What is Philosophy? To think about the notion of the concept, that philosophy generates concepts which become generative in a particularly rich and dynamic way. And as I say, I'm exploring that note. There's very little work, in fact, of this kind, because the field itself tended to come in, certainly in the Anglo world, came out of more or less out of a practical administration in the States, and part of the work of bringing educational theory and philosophy, or theory and philosophy, to bear in this area means interrogating and elaborating the concept of curriculum, the curriculum concept itself. Now, as I say, all of those, I think, need to be brought together, but they can also be thought separately, and there's lots of work that still needs to be done to do this. If I just point again to the notion of curriculum field as field, a field of study is charged with organising, having organised within it a body of scholarship, of investigation, the warrants for investigation. It's also concerned with the maintenance and renewal, that is the reproduction of that body of knowledge, and those bodies that and those knowledge workers within that field of study. So as we do research and do curriculum and make curriculum, and as we think about the curriculum concept, we build the field, okay, in an organised way. And I would say that all of us have a responsibility to be aware of something like this picture, and to, in various ways, some more explicitly than others, be thinking, as well as doing and making curriculum, about what is this view of, what is our view of curriculum, okay, and how does it relate to the health of the field. Hopefully we can have some discussion as we work through there, work through at the end of the presentation. In thinking about curriculum inquiry in Australia, I did a kind of like a survey paper in 2003, Curriculum Inquiry in Australia, a local genealogy of the curriculum field, published in the International Handbook of Curriculum Studies. One of the things that became clear in that paper, and I've tried to build a body of work following on from there, is how relatively recent the field is in Australia. It was only in the late 70s and the early 80s that it started to come together, and the Australian Curriculum Studies Association was formed around 82, 83. Its first conference, I think, was in 83, and it's still existing today. Though not necessarily in a strong state, as with all professional associations, it seems. There are difficulties in maintaining membership and momentum. But you know, that's really quite recent, 50 years. The scene in Britain is little older. The one in the States actually goes back to the early part of the 20th century and has become a major reference point and point of generation for the field more broadly, including in Australia. In 2018, I convened the 6th International Conference, the 6th World Conference of the International Association for the Advancement of Curriculum Studies. It was I think, a successful event, and Stephen, I think well, I know you were there, and I've actually been really pleased to see the movement since then, because I'd initially expressed the view in the 2003 paper that the field was running, was losing momentum, certainly in its theoretical scholarship, and for a while it disappeared. And I think there's a reason for that, is the emergence of an increasingly national and federal concern with what became eventually the Australian curriculum in 2008 and 2011. Since then, I think there's been pleasing signs of work in the area, in curriculum inquiry, as I say. Some books published, symposia, events like this one focused on curriculum, symposia in ARE, including this year, that I'm participating in. There's also an event at RMIT in September 25 on teachers as curriculum workers, and that's really pleasing to see developments like that, and some younger scholars, as it were, coming back, people coming back to curriculum inquiry and curriculum studies in this country, and also elsewhere. The thing I will say about that is it's very school referenced. It's very much a, it takes as its base schooling in various sorts of ways. And of course, there's a lot of curriculum work happening outside of schools, and hopefully that's one of the things that can come up in today's presentation. I thought it was worthwhile also sharing with you this quote from Michael Young. He says, as curriculum theorists, we have to become like dual specialists. Our primary specialization is curriculum theory. He's referring to himself and his readers in this instance. However, we also need a level of familiarity with the specialist fields we are investigating, whether it is university, engineering, or early reading. On the whole, and I think this is really important, this is where curriculum theory falls down, and even perhaps why it does not develop. The two forms of specialization, curriculum theory and the particular field under investigation, are rarely brought together. Now, I am convinced of the validity of that last observation. The book I did in 2018 under the title Engaging Curriculum sought to bring together curriculum theory, work in curriculum theory, and work in English teaching, the subject English, which is a field that I've done, I've worked in most of my career, alongside a number of other things. And these two areas for me are both the curriculum theory work I do and the work in English teaching, English curriculum in particular, that I've done for a long time. And I think it's interesting to think about this group here today. Stephen, for instance, VOC-Ed and curriculum inquiry, perhaps. And there'll be many others who can think about this, whether they are doing explicitly curriculum theory and another area, or whether they're working in that area, and the balance of emphases that are possible in doing that. As I say, considerable work thinking about curriculum inquiry in Australia. That conference in 2018 was the 6th in a series of international curriculum conferences under the auspices of the International Association for the Advancement of Curriculum Studies, and Phil Piner and others have been key players in that initiative. And it's an attempt to think about curriculum work and curriculum inquiry outside of national borders, internationally, and as it were, globally. It's still a growing area of various kinds. Work in different countries across the world, and scholars working increasingly in an international or transnational way, bringing together a kind of comparative stance in thinking about curriculum and schooling, and there's several points that can be made here. One is the notion of the persistence of the nation. It's sometimes thought that with globalization, the nation and the work of nation building, which has been traditionally associated with curriculum and schooling, is somewhat superseded. And yet curriculum across the world is still framed significantly by national cultures. And, national curriculum, for instance, in different countries, thinks outside its borders, but also inside its borders, about the national identity and increasingly national security, and education and schooling and curriculum is reflected in that. At the same time as the nation persists, I think, as a reference point, we also need to be thinking outside and beyond the nation in various sorts of ways. And I'll give the example of rural education, which is a field I've been associated with in the Australian context for a number of years. As it turns out, and as it's quite predictable in some ways, it's possible to think about, it's possible and necessary and very useful to think about rural schooling, rural education in other countries and globally. And this starts to raise the issue of, if you like, global rural studies in education and schooling. This idea of thinking beyond the nation. And I might give the example of teacher education as well. And obviously there's an international awareness of that, maybe other fields. Gayatri Spivak has written about comparativism, and I think it's an important issue in this regard. In terms of my own work, this year I did a keynote in Mauritius at the 8th conference of the International Association for the Advancement of Curriculum Studies, IACS, post-national curriculum, a tale of two countries. And the two countries I was looking at there are New Zealand and Australia, having done work, Australia and other countries, and drawn in the literature looking at other countries. So a tale of two countries, Australia and New Zealand, and thinking about national curriculum in those cases comparatively. And the other work is something is part of that study, looking at there's a new English national English curriculum being developed in New Zealand. So trying to think those things through and thinking about this as under the label of transnational curriculum inquiry. Now, curriculum and pedagogy. I put that up and I put a question mark because in fact that is not a formulation that I use myself quite deliberately. I know it's an FOR category, and when we do our paperwork, administrative registrations and so on within the university, it comes up. I want to problematize it though in the context of what I'm talking about today, and I'll come back to it in a moment. Understanding curriculum, and this is where this is part of thinking through curriculum as a concept and thinking about the work of conceptualisation, which is much more than simply defining curriculum. Definitions of curriculum, there are many, but there's, as I say, there's very little work on the conceptualisation of curriculum, in my view. I want to suggest that, and this is work that I'm currently trying to think my way through, that there are what I might call obligatory elements in the concept of curriculum. One is certainly knowledge. And this is where a lot of recent debate in curriculum inquiry, curriculum studies has focused. And Michael Young has been very important about this, the idea of bringing knowledge in. For him and his colleagues, it's very much disciplinary knowledge and school subjects. And he has a fairly straightforward view of the movement from disciplines to subjects. It works for some, it doesn't work for all of them. And you know, that's an ongoing debate. But I think knowledge, the importance of knowledge, is an absolutely crucial component of any understanding, any conceptualization of curriculum. And the other one is pedagogy. What I think is a fair thing to say is that the work that, say, Michael Young and others is associated with, but also Piner in a slightly different way, and perhaps also our national curriculum designers, pedagogy is a second order. It's applied to the primary order of knowledge. I want to suggest that any adequate view of curriculum must include knowledge and pedagogy, and in a very simple sense, I'll put this as the articulation, literally the articulation of knowledge and pedagogy as crucial components. Just to complicate things, it's also both knowledge and pedagogy are themselves concepts which need to be interrogated. Not assumed, but interrogated. And this is where the Deleuzian notion of, and Deleuzo-Guattarian notion of concepts and conceptualization is relevant. Concepts include and generate concepts. So the articulation of knowledge and pedagogy as a minimum. Now, I wanted to at least make mention of another resource for curriculum thinking, which is what's called didactic studies in Europe. Very big in the Nordic countries, in Germany, in Holland, but broadly in Europe itself, not in England. With didactic, not, I put it there and no doubt mispronounce it, because it doesn't is not adequately rendered by the word, English word, didactic. Within that is a notion, the didactic triangle, and of subject matter, teacher and student, a three-way relationship, an always three-way relationship, which I think is very important. The idea of curriculum, understanding curriculum as in various sorts of ways, the integration of knowledge and pedagogy, and as I say, a shadow, an influence there, or a resource for thinking that through is the European work. Curriculum studies and didactic studies don't exactly map onto each other, but they're useful to know about and to think and to try and draw in. And let me actually go back there. My point, going back to my heading here, is I would draw a line through and pedagogy altogether, and my preferred pairing, if you like, would be curriculum and assessment. These are the two message systems, the two crucial message systems, if you like, informing education or being realised in education. And at this point, I must make a reference to Bernstein, because I know that there are people at, particularly at Griffith, who are Bernstein scholars, and he is undoubtedly a major figure in all of this. I find his three-part distinction between three message systems, what he calls curriculum knowledge, curriculum, pedagogy and assessment. I have some worries about that, and perhaps we can come back to that. It's not my reference point. My larger category is curriculum as knowledge and pedagogy. Okay, final slide. I wanted to finish with some thoughts of this notion of curriculum and schooling, curriculum beyond schooling. It's not going to, looks like it's not coming up, Shannon. So I'll see what I can do here. No, that last slide's not coming up for some reason, but let me talk it through. Generally, when we think of curriculum, we're thinking about the school curriculum, the curriculum of schooling, most commonly in terms of an array of subjects, of school subjects. And in this regard, another quote from Pienaar, the curriculum is the intellectual and organisational centre of education, of schooling. I would say, and if we think about it as the intellectual and organisational centre of education, that's an interesting thought in itself. I had another quote there. The curriculum is embodied quite concretely in the framework and processes of the school in all its practices, implicit and explicit. And that's a somewhat different rendering of curriculum and schooling. All of what that, I think, pertains to school education. And as I've indicated previously, that's the major reference point, seems to be the major reference point for curriculum inquiry. However, I want to extend that and think, can we think curriculum in other realms, in undergraduate education, in the university, in professional education, for instance, teacher education, but also nursing education, engineering education, and so on. In doctoral education, and I've tried to do some of this work myself, what it would be to think of curriculum in doctoral supervision and doctoral studies. But going beyond that, again, curriculum as the integration and articulation of knowledge and pedagogy at a minimum in other sites, other educational sites, like museums, like zoos, like art galleries, like theme parks, like the media. I could go on, but I think that's a good point to end with, so that we can open it up for discussions. Stephen, what do you think?